Ready
All
to
right.
rant.
Welcome to the Read and Rant podcast, and welcome to something new, something different, and something that isn't about telling you what to think about history. It's about asking you to look at the evidence, because the books tell us what happened, and the legends tell us what people remember. But somewhere between the two is the real story. All right. Welcome to History Unfiltered. All right. But before we begin, I want to make the purpose of this series absolutely clear, 100% crystal clear. The Read It Rant podcast condemns racism, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, racial hatred, slavery, discrimination, and hatred or dehumanization directed toward any group of people. Discussing historical racism, slavery, racial ideologies, political extremism, or other disturbing aspects of history does not constitute an endorsement of them. This series exists for education and historical discussion. I'm going to repeat that. This series exists for education and historical discussion. And when History Unfiltered tackles a controversial subject, we're going to try to do something incredibly important. We're going to separate what the historical record actually says from what we might want it to say. Not me personally. I know what history says, and that's what I go by. We're going to go back to primary documents. We're going to look at speeches, government records, declarations, contemporary accounts, and modern historical scholarship. We are lifting the mask from the simplified version of history many of us remember from school and ask what actually happened. And today we're going to start one of the biggest questions in American history. And that question is, what caused the American Civil War? You know, if you ask anybody on the street that question, they'll probably get a one-word answer, which is slavery. And here's where History Unfiltered immediately becomes important. Because saying the Civil War was about slavery isn't exactly wrong, but depending on what we mean by about, it can be incomplete. At the same time, going to the opposite extreme and claiming that slavery had literally nothing to do with secession of the southern states is contradicted by overwhelming evidence, including the words of the Confederate political leaders themselves. So we're not choosing between two slogans, we are examining the evidence. Because the National Park Service summarizes the approaching conflict as involving economic policies, cultural values, federal power, and most importantly, slavery's role in American society. Those issues become entangled with one another, with slavery, expansion, property, federal versus state authority, sectional political power, economics, tariffs, constitutional interpretation, succession, and eventually preservation of the Union itself. So let's pull those threads apart, all right? Which leads us into part two, which is let the South speak for itself. If you're asking why southern states seceded, there's an obvious source that should be near the top of our list, which is the southern states themselves. And we don't have to guess. Several states already actually told us, because Mississippi's declaration of secession is extraordinarily direct. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. That is the stance that Mississippi took. That's not something a modern historian wrote. Mississippi said that in their secession documents in 1861. Georgia's declaration complained extensively about northern states and the federal political struggles surrounding African slavery, including disputes over slavery in the territories and enforcement of constitutional obligations concerning enslaved people. And then there's Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederate States of America. In his famous cornerstone speech of March 1861, Stephens explicitly described African slavery as the immediate cause of the rupture, and he defended a racial hierarchy that basically helped black people below white people. That's enormously important, because if we're going to call this show History Unfiltered, we cannot filter that out simply because we're interested in additional causes. Slavery wasn't something historians randomly inserted in the story generations later. Confederate leaders themselves talked about it actually all the time. But here's where things get a little bit more complicated. The South absolutely invoked ideas of state sovereignty. You know, Jefferson Davis, for example, declared that the states are sovereign when leaving the U.S. Senate. Lincoln rejected that constitutional interpretation because from Lincoln's perspective, the Union was perpetual. A state couldn't simply announce we're leaving. And the National Park Service summarizes Lincoln's argument as essentially saying that lawful government could not survive if individual states could dissolve the Union whenever they disagree with an election or federal policy. But suddenly, the question becomes bigger. Where does sovereignty ultimately reside? With individual states or with the United States as one nation? That is a genuine constitutional conflict. But there's an essential follow-up question whenever someone says the Confederacy fought for states' rights. And in specific, states' rights to do what? If you read the secession documents, and slavery repeatedly comes roaring back into the conversation, you know, rights involving enslaved property. fugitive slaves, slavery in federal territories, northern resistance to enforcing laws protecting slaveholders, the political future of slavery. So states' rights and slavery weren't necessarily competing explanations, they were frequently intertwined. And I think a lot of people, including myself, understand. And this is one of my biggest questions about the president. Everybody makes him out to be this amazing guy, but up front, what Lincoln was, don't get me wrong, the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation did what it should do. And, by all, everybody is equal in my eyes. I grew up with everybody and anybody. This part of this podcast is dedicated solely to educate and inform, not to be there's no hatred at all. This is just purely informational, and it's all my sources are all cited. But I want to make it known that Lincoln wasn't running an abolitionist crusade in 1861 before he took office on March 4th. Because I think this is another piece that really gets lost when history gets compressed into a couple paragraphs. Lincoln entered office opposing the expansion of slavery, but he was not initially proposing immediate federal abolition of slavery everywhere it already existed, because the Library of Congress notes that Lincoln's first inaugural address denied an intention to interfere with slavery within states where it already existed. That matters, because the Union's initial war objective wasn't simply invade the South and abolish slavery. Lincoln's overriding objective at the outbreak of war was preservation of the United States. The abolition of slavery increasingly became a Union war objective as the conflict continued, culminating politically and militarily in measures including the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately constitutionally through the 13th and 14th Amendment with birthright citizenship. That distinction is crucial. The causes of Southern secession, the Union government's initial reason for fighting, and the objectives the Union developed during 4 years of war are related, but they aren't identical questions. And I think we also need to talk about another controversial argument, which we're going to get into, which is tariffs. The industrializing North generally had stronger political constituencies, favoring protective tariffs. Southern agricultural interests generally preferred lower tariffs because the South exported commodities and imported manufactured goods. And then when the North imposed those heavy tariffs on the South, that affected Southern economy because, slavery was a commodity back then and the South had more exports than the North. And these economic disagreements were seriously real. They weren't invented. The Republican platform included support for higher protective tariffs, and the National Park Service identifies economic policy as one component of the broader sectional conflict. Then came the morale tariff. It substantially raised tariff rates. And here's an incredibly important fact. The United States Senate own historical chronology says a morale tariff passed the Senate on March 2nd, 1861. Lincoln took office on March 4th. But South Carolina has succeeded in December of 1860, and by February of 1861, 7 states had already formed the Confederacy. That timeline matters. So the claim that Lincoln imposed massive new tariffs and therefore the original 7 states succeeded doesn't survive chronological scrutiny. They were already gone. That doesn't make tariffs irrelevant. Economic sectionalization, I can't talk today. Economic sectionalism had existed for decades. The tariff battles of earlier generations, particularly the nullification crisis of the 1830s, had already produced serious, constitutional arguments about federal authority and Southern resistance. And the fact that Southern senators had resisted the Morrill Tariff before leaving Washington demonstrates that tariff policy remained a genuine sectional disagreement. But this genuine disagreement is different from saying the Civil War was really caused by Lincoln's taxes. The historical evidence really doesn't justify going that far. There is, however, another fascinating part of this story. Lincoln made it clear that he intended to enforce federal law. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln maintained that the Union legally remained intact and that federal laws would continue to be executed, including those harsh tariffs on southern states. And customs revenue mattered. Before modern federal income taxation, tariffs were a major source of federal revenue. And Lincoln discussed retaining federal property and collecting duties. He also addressed Southern accusations that such actions amounted to coercion. And before his inauguration, Lincoln explicitly discussed the controversy over whether holding federal forts and collecting duties should be considered coercion or invasion. And think about the constitutional collision happening here. The Confederacy says we have left the United States. Lincoln's government says no, legally you haven't. The Confederacy therefore regards certain federal actions as the actions of a foreign power. Lincoln regards those same actions as a federal government simply enforcing federal law within its own territory. Two completely incompatible theories of sovereignty, and there is almost no room between them. But then we get to the point where everything explodes, literally. Fort Sumter sat in Charleston Harbor. Federal troops remained inside. Lincoln decided to resupply the fort. Confederate forces opened fire on April 12th, 1861. And I think it's crazy that people think this was the start of the Civil War when in reality, 7 southern states already seceded from the Union in 1860. So technically, the South already started the Civil War long before Lincoln's presidency in 1860 because of those 7 states leaving the Union. However, after Sumter surrendered, Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to suppress the rebellion, and that decision really changed the political equation again. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas then joined the Confederacy, on top of the already 7 states that were seceded from 1860. That's another reason a one sentence explanation struggles of what started the American Civil War because the motivations of the original Deep South secessionists were not necessarily identical to every motivation held by every Virginian, Tennessean, or individual Confederate soldier. Likewise, individual Union soldiers could fight for different reasons. One could fight for the Union, another for emancipation, another because his neighbors enlisted, another believed because he believed it was his patriotic obligation. And the National Park Services specifically cautions that individual soldiers' motivations could involve combinations of political, economic, social, and personal values that did not perfectly correspond with their government's objectives. Government causes and individual motivations are not always the same thing. And now we reach one of those historical facts that can produce an immediate reaction. Does society realize that there were free black Americans who legally owned enslaved people? Yes, that is the truth. It's historically documented. Historian Philip J. Schwartz examined free black slaveholding slave owners in Virginia and describes it as real, but anomalous phenomenon existing within Virginia's larger white supremacist slave society. And historian Larry Koger has likewise researched black slaveholding in South Carolina using census records, wills, bills of sale, tax records, and newspaper material. But here's where History Unfiltered requires context instead of clickbait. Not every case meant the same thing. Some free black people purchased relatives or spouses who were legally enslaved. Others genuinely participated economically in slavery and exploited enslaved labor. Both realities existed. And the existence of black slaveholders doesn't change the fundamental racial structure of American chattel slavery. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Americans were black, and Southern law and society constructed slavery around racial hierarchy. So the accurate statement is black people owned slaves too, therefore race wasn't important. That's false. The accurate statement is American slavery was a racialized system dominated by white slaveholders while a comparatively small number of free black people also legally held enslaved people for reasons ranging from protecting family members within restrictive laws to economic exploitation. History is capable of containing uncomfortable facts simultaneously. And here's another piece of context worth discussing. The United States did not invent slavery. Slavery existed across human civilizations long before the U.S. even existed. Different forms of bondage appeared across Africa, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Americas over thousands of years. But that fact doesn't minimize American slavery. In fact, the Smithsonian describes the Atlantic world as producing a transformed form of slavery beginning roughly 500 years ago. The transatlantic system became heavily racialized. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands while European colonial economies developed systems in which the enslaved status became hereditary and closely associated with African ancestry. So slavery is ancient, but every slave system existed in its own historical context. Saying slavery exists before America does not absolve American slaveholders any more than discovering an ancient murderer makes a modern murder acceptable. Um, Historical context explains it doesn't excuse. There's another trap that people fall into. They ask, was the Civil War about economics or slavery? But in the antebellum South, those categories weren't cleanly separable. Enslaved human beings represented enormous amounts of capital. Slave labor produced cotton and other commodities that powered the Southern economy and fed international textile markets. Mississippi's own declaration effectively merged the economic and slavery arguments by describing slavery as its great material interest and tying slave labor directly to commerce. That's extraordinary evidence. The people writing the document didn't say slavery over here, economics over there. They said essentially slavery is an economic interest. So when someone says if it wasn't slavery, it was economics, the obvious response is what it was a huge portion of the Southern economy built around that enslaved labor. Um, and I want to point out too, talking about Mississippi, if people want to get really down to the nitty gritty, Mississippi was one of the last states to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It's going to shock a lot of people, but they didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until I was 5 years old in 1995. And if you don't believe me, Google it, look that up. It's the truth. Um, and I think we're going to enter another fascinating historical debate. There were absolutely Americans who regarded Lincoln as a tyrant, or even tyrannical. The administration would eventually take extraordinary wartime actions concerning military authority, arrests. He suspended habeas corpus, confiscation, taxation, and federal power. And historians continued debating the constitutional dimensions of Lincoln's wartime presidency. But there's an important distinction. Saying some Southerners consider Lincoln a tyrant is a historical statement. Saying Lincoln was objectively a tyrant and that's why the South seceded is that's an interpretation, and it's an incomplete one at that. Because remember the timeline. South Carolina seceded before Lincoln even became president. The first 7 Confederate states had left before he was even inaugurated. They weren't responding to 4 years of Lincoln administration policy. They were responding largely to what they believed his election of the Republican Party represented for their future, especially the future of slavery, which, to be honest, in my opinion, my professional historical opinion, it would have died out anyway because Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which revolutionized, the actual, manufacture and everything of cotton. So it would have been rendered moot eventually. But there is slavery still going on today. They don't want to talk about it, but it is. But let's get back to it. Um, because the Smithsonian summarizes the situation plainly. Lincoln's election threatened slavery's survival in the eyes of many Southern officials, and it really helped drive their decision to secede. Um, However, once the war begins, the meaning of the war changes, and that's another thing. Our simplified narratives that were taught in school sometimes struggle to communicate. Wars evolve, political objectives evolve as the wars rage on. Military necessities change political possibilities. Because to be honest, I know Lincoln's cabinet actually said that enslaved people could be considered contraband and confiscated as war contraband, and then freed under the proclamations that he's done. Um, and enslaved people played an enormous role by fleeing toward Union lines and forcing the federal government to confront what freedom would mean in practice. And then came the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. And on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln's final proclamation declared enslaved people in designated areas still in rebellion to be free. It didn't instantly abolish slavery everywhere. Slaveholding border states loyal to the Union were not covered in the same way, but the proclamation fundamentally transformed the character of the conflict. And by the end, Union victory and destruction of Confederate power would be inseparable from slavery's destruction. And in December of 1865, which this is false. Actually, yeah, it is. No, it is. This is true. Sorry. Slavery, the 13th Amendment was passed July 31st of 1865. Not every state ratified it in December of 1865. Even though it constitutionally was ratified and abolished slavery throughout the United States, except as punishment for a crime, there were states like Texas, and Mississippi and other southern states that didn't ratify it right away. And actually, because they didn't ratify it right away, when Grant became president, he actually had to pass the Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution, because southern states and southern Democrats still wanted Jim Crow laws in effect. And it got to the point where he had to declare martial law in the South because of the southern states changing votes and still having Jim Crow laws and still trying to keep enslaved people on plantations. That probably carried out until probably even past Grant's presidency later on in the 1800s, early 1900s, when the Union troops finally drew back and a lot of states started ratifying it. And then the industrialization happened. The Cotton Gin came along, and slavery slowly but surely died. It wasn't truly gone, and it still truly isn't gone today. Not in this context, but in other ways. But well, that's another topic for another podcast. Um, However, now we come back to our original question: what was the War really fought about, or actually about? Was it slavery? Yes, slavery was central to the cessation crisis. and the primary documents make that impossible to reasonably dismiss. Was it states' rights and sovereignty? Yes, but many of the specific rights Southern secessionists were defending involved slavery, enslaved property, and slavery's expansion or protection. And were economics involved? Absolutely. And were tariffs disputed? Yes. Did tariffs cause the original Deep South states to leave because Lincoln imposed enormous taxes upon them? The timeline does not support that claim because those tariffs were passed before Lincoln even, took office. Um, and was preserving the Union central to Lincoln's initial war objective, which is, yes, absolutely. He wanted to enforce federal law. And did abolition eventually become central to the Union war effort, which is yes. And did individual soldiers fight for different reasons? Of course. And did some free black Americans own enslaved people? Yes, but they represent an unusual minority phenomenon requiring substantial context. And did slavery exist throughout human history before the United States? Absolutely. I mean, as a settler during the French and Indian, or before the French and Indian War, and even during the French and Indian War, there were a lot of white colonists that had to actually be in bondage and indentured servitude for 7 years to buy their freedom because they would book passage to America. They would have to work for 7 years to get their freedom, and the only land available to those poor white colonists, or Europeans for that matter, was the frontier. Now, does that absolve or erase slavery's central importance to the cessation crisis? No. It does not erase slavery's central importance to the cessation crisis, and that's the point. You know, and I think maybe the biggest mistake we make when studying history is approaching it like we're choosing sides of a football game. North good, South bad, Lincoln state, Lincoln dictator, slavery caused everything, slavery caused nothing. Those make great slogans, but they make terrible historical methodology. Human beings are very complicated. History is written by victors. Governments are complicated. Wars are extraordinarily complicated, and sometimes the most uncomfortable thing history can tell us is several things can be true at the same time. Lincoln could initially fight primarily to preserve the Union, while the crisis that shattered the Union was deeply rooted in slavery. Southern political leaders could genuinely believe in state sovereignty while simultaneously using that doctrine to defend slavery, and economic grievances could be real while slavery remained central. Free black slaveholders could exist inside a system that overwhelmingly structured around white political power and black enslavement. And slavery could predate America by thousands of years, while American racial chattel slavery remained one of the defining injustices of American history. None of those facts cancel out the others. They contextualize them. And maybe that's what, History Unfiltered needs to be about. Not telling you that everything your teacher taught you is a lie, but because that would just replace one simplistic narrative with another. Instead, we're going to ask you to do something harder. Read the documents for yourself. Read Mississippi's Declaration. Read how they didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. Read Georgia's Declaration. Read Lincoln's. Read Jefferson Davis. Read Alexander Stephens. Read the abolitionists. Read the soldiers. Read the formerly enslaved. Read the people who actually lived through the history that we're debating. Then compare what they said, because history really becomes dangerous when we start with the conclusion we want and search backward for evidence. History really becomes powerful when we're willing to follow the evidence, even when it complicates what we already believe. That's what we're doing here. No heroes that are made are flawless. No villains made simple. No uncomfortable document conveniently pushed off the table. And no political party gets to own history. And no ideology gets to rewrite the primary sources. And no viral meme gets to substitute for evidence. All right? This is History Unfiltered. The books tell us what happened. The legends tell us what people remember. But somewhere between the two is a real story. All right? Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, keep digging. And as always, embrace the rant. All right? Reading and Rant is out.